Um, so I'm going to talk about a project that is not just my own research project, but it's the work of a committee of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And I am co-chairing this committee with Peter Orszag, who was the former director of the Congressional Budget Office in the United States. And there are many distinguished economists, demographers, sociologists on this committee. And this work is, I have to call it preliminary because the report of this committee's work is going to be released next week. And so I don't know whether there is any press present, but if so, this really shouldn't be publicized until next week, September 17th, when the report will be released. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, there are three parts to what I'm going to talk about. The first is just to review the literature and some new work on the socioeconomic differentials in longevity in the United States and the fact that these have been widening in recent decades. That's the first part. The second part is to examine the way that this widening of the longevity differences affects the progressivity of government programs for older people in the US. And then, of course, the fact that population is aging is going to require policy adjustments, things like the retirement age rising and so on. The third part of this project looks at some of the policy adjustments that have been proposed and how they interact with the changes in the dispersion of longevity by socioeconomic status. Okay, so that's where we are going here. Why do we care about this? Well, it's not a general concern, really, because there are many things the government does in which we wouldn't worry about socioeconomic class differences in longevity. For example, national defense. So someone who lives a long time enjoys the benefits of national defense for more decades than someone who dies at a shorter time. But there's no particular age or time aspect to the sort of national defense. It's unlike, say, public pensions or public health care or long-term care, which do have a strong age-time dimension and indeed to some degree substitute for individual private plans for providing for old age through savings, investment, and then dissaving at older ages. So it's these kinds of programs for which this problem arises. So now I go to the first part, disparities in mortality. We also use the term gradient, the socioeconomic gradient, and so on. In the US, this topic really surfaced in 1973 with a classic study by Kitagawa and Hauser that used 1960 data and looked at differences by education. Why do people look at differences by education and not income? Well, education is relatively fixed over the life cycle. There is relatively little reverse causality, but for income, there's a big problem, as I'll come to in a moment. So most people, including myself, have thought that the socioeconomic differences have diminished in the US, and in some respects they have. So it's very striking that differences between the African American population and the white population have diminished, particularly in the last couple of decades, so that the difference in life expectancy at 50 is only 2.8 years now, whereas it used to be something like 5 or 6 years. At the same time, and counterintuitively, differences by education and by income have been widening. And this, frankly, I didn't believe myself because I knew that black-white differences were getting narrower. But in the course of this project, I became convinced that this is true. So we'll be looking at those data in a sec. So mortality and income, as I said, the difficulty here, if we just look at the association of mortality and income in a given year at the individual level, there's a big bias in our result because we're seeing a lot of the effect of health on income rather than the effect of income on health. Someone gets sick, they have to drop out of the labor force, they have to spend money out of pocket, their assets go down, and so on. And so we can't just look at that association. And well, I'll explain what we do later. There are many different approaches have been taken to try to deal with this problem. And the use of education is motivated by the fact that education is relatively fixed over the lifetime. We don't have so much problem of reverse causality. But there's another big problem, and that big problem is the increasing adverse selection of those in the lower educational categories and the decreasing favorable selection of those in the higher education categories. Now, almost everyone is getting at least a high school education, and many more people are getting a college education or a PhD even. So the meaning of education has changed, and if we ignore this problem of selectivity, then again, we're going to get an exaggerated measure of the socioeconomic differences. So one way of dealing with this with education that has hardly ever been done is to use educational quantiles describing the position in the education distribution rather than the absolute level. That, of course, has some problems as well. Okay, so let's look at some of this recent literature on education and life expectancy. A much cited study is Mara et al. David Cutler, a very well-known health economist, is one of the co-authors. So we look here at life expectancy at 25 in the year 2000, and we're looking at the difference between life expectancy at 25 of those with some college, at least, versus those with high school or less. Okay, so we just divide the population in half, and for African American men, that gap is more than 8 years of those with college or more, some college at least, or high school or less. To me, that looks like an enormous difference. And we see it's very similar for white men. So furthermore, these differences, if we compare 1990 to 2000, these differences have grown by something like 1.5 to 2 years. So we see both the size of these differences and the fact that they've been increasing in recent years. So even as the differences by race, that, as I mentioned before, the black-white differences have narrowed, the differences within each category by educational status have widened. Now, to continue, there was another important study by Rostron et al. This looked at life expectancy at age 45. This is all period life expectancy in 2003, 2005. And there were some data problem adjustments that were introduced by this article. But here we're looking at differences on the order of 10 to 12 years for females, high education versus low education, and 11 to 16 years for males in life expectancy at 45. These are astonishingly big differences to my mind. I still find them hard to believe. Another article by a group of analysts, sort of aging people, Olshansky et al. Came out in 2012. It was on the front page of the New York Times and other newspapers and so on. This study found that the life expectancy of white women with fewer than 12 years of education had actually declined between 1990 and 2008 by 4 or 5 years. That also seems astonishing. And we see more generally the difference in life expectancy between men with less than 12 years of education and those with more than 16. So we're talking with those who haven't graduated from college compared to those who haven't graduated from high school compared to those who have graduated from college. That difference rose from 13 years to 14 years. This is in life expectancy at birth, sort of approximated. Astonishingly great, and for women, it rose from almost 8 years to 10 years or so. These differences are just hard to comprehend, I think. Now, those studies did not adjust for this problem of changing selectivity in terms of who is it who is not graduating from high school, what proportion of the population isn't, and so on. So this study by Bound et al. Is the first I've seen. It came out not yet published, I think, presented last summer. Looked at education by quartiles. So compared the mortality of the bottom 25% in terms of educational attainment to the top 75%. For 2010, and found a difference of 6 or 7 years. And also, when looked at this way, that lower quantile of women did not have declining life expectancy anymore. It was pretty much flat rather than declining. And again, I don't show it there, but they also found a widening of the differences in recent years. And then there was a very recent National Bureau of Economic Research paper by Goldring et al. Its headline title was that it found no increase in the gradient, no steepening in this gradient. But when I looked carefully at the paper, I see that what they mean by that is that the additive, and this was a very methodologically sophisticated paper, it's a very good paper, but what it finds is that additively mortality at each socioeconomic status declined the same amount. But of course, proportionately, that means that it declined much more at high socioeconomic status than at low. So I think it's completely consistent with all the rest of this literature. So that's the literature on education and life expectancy. And now I want to turn to income and life expectancy. And the key study here was by Hilary Waldron, an analyst at the Social Security Administration, the public pension system in the US. Well, I won't go over all the details I listed there because time is already passing too fast. But basically, it's using Social Security earnings histories data, the data that come from people's participation in the system as they report their earnings, or their employers report their earnings each year. And I do have to say something about it. So she constructed a variable that is, we might call it mid-career earnings at ages 45 to 55, averaged with some adjustments. Ideally, the idea was to have lifetime earnings starting from the beginning in the labor force, but it's not really possible with these kinds of data because the system was expanding. Many people didn't join the public pension system until maybe they were 40 or something like that. So you'd miss an earlier part if you tried to do lifetime earnings, and it would be, some people would have them and others wouldn't. So this is the way it's done, and we do something like this as well. And then she uses a contrast of the top half and the bottom half of the income distribution defined in that way. And the mortality data also come from Social Security, and we'll just go on to this graph, this very striking graph, which has, okay, this is cohort mortality, longitudinally calculated mortality. We have birth cohort on the horizontal axis starting in 1912 and ending in 1941. And we're looking at life expectancy at age 65 for the bottom half of the income distribution and for the top half of the income distribution. And so you see is the gap in life expectancy at 65 has increased by 4.5 years as we move across those 30 years of birth cohorts. You see that almost the entire increase, you see that for the lower half, there's been almost no change at all in life expectancy at 65, whereas for the top half, there's been a substantial and steady increase. Now, at the same time, I have to warn that for the early cohort, 1912, we're observing the cohort for many years of its life and exposure to mortality risk. As we come to more and more recently born cohorts, there's less and less actual observation of the mortality of that cohort. So for the 1941 cohort, actually there's only 1 year observed above age 65. So that's a problem with these data and to be kept in mind. So this was got a lot of attention, rightly, I think. And one of the articles that followed it was Barry Bosworth and Burke, and they followed that general design, but they used the Health and Retirement Survey. They define mid-career earnings as 41 to 50, so that they can, well, for a couple of reasons. For this analysis and for Waldron's, results for females are much shakier than results for males. I think I'll pass over this now to go to our own so that we have time for all of this. So then, following the Bosworth and Burke study, the committee made its own estimates, again using Health and Retirement Survey data linked to Social Security earnings history data. One detail I'll mention, or two points. We use mortality quintiles. We look at people's positions in the income distribution, defined in this mid-career way by the top 20% and next and so on. Because we do that, we don't know the role of absolute differences in income or earnings in explaining or accounting for this widening dispersion in life expectancy. This is all relative, and the quintiles they're always there, whether the income distribution is narrow or wide. So unfortunately, we can't address that question with this method. Okay. Let's see what we find. So let me compare the birth cohorts of 1930 and 1960. For the 1930 birth cohort, we're observing deaths from age 62 to 78 after age 50. For the 1960 cohort, we're observing no deaths at all, and this is a sort of extrapolation from the fitted model. So that is, you need to keep that in mind as well. You could think of it as saying, well, what would be the outcome if these trends in widening dispersion have continued? And we choose this 1960 cohort because it's really the relevant one for policies. It will turn 60 in 2020, and that's about the time when any policies that are introduced in the next few years would become be in place. Okay, so the blue lines here are showing life expectancy at 50 by income quintile in 1930. The red ones by income quintile in 1960, for the 1960 cohort. And you can see here that the increases are virtually all at the high income end of things. That's true both for males and for females. The males are on top, females are on the bottom. You can see we do find that life expectancy at the bottom female quintile actually is lower, has come down for 1960 cohort. We find that the difference between the top and the bottom quintile for males grows from 5 years to almost 13 years. That is consistent with the Waldron results. And the difference for females grows from about 4 years to 13 and a half years. Okay, so these seem very big, but they're not really inconsistent with the earlier data studies I reviewed. Okay, so now the second part, how do these widening differences interact with the government program structure? And we're looking at Social Security pensions, disability insurance, a kind of special pension for poor people, Medicare, which is health care for the elderly, publicly provided health care for those over 65 in the US, Medicaid, which is health care for poor people, but it also covers long-term care for the elderly who have few assets. And so Medicaid is important for long-term care, but it's not a general population program, it is a need-based program. We do two simulation experiments. In the first experiment, well, in both experiments, we're holding the policy rules constant as they are in 2010. And we're holding the individual earnings histories and so on the same as they actually are in the Health and Retirement Survey and in the Social Security earnings history data. That's the same in both simulations I'm going to report. So what is the difference between these two simulations? They are done assuming two different mortality regimes. The first is done assuming the mortality regime of the 1930 birth cohort, the second, the projected mortality regime for the 1960 birth cohort. And then there are some associated differences in health and disability that come along with these differences in mortality. So that's all that's differing. All the basic economic substructure is the same for these two experiments. And so then, given these simulation experiments, we calculate the present value of the benefits received and taxes paid above age 50 until death. So we simulate out until death for each individual. And then we compare these present values and the differences in these present values by income quintile across the two mortality regimes. So that's what we'll be looking at. And to implement these calculations, we use a software program, a microsimulation program called Future Elderly Model, which is a very well-established model in the US, based on the Health and Retirement Survey, with a lot of detail on health, disability, mortality, and program costs and benefits. Okay, so here we go. So for our present value calculations, we assume a discount rate of 2.9%, real discount rate, because that's what the Social Security Administration uses in its calculations. So if we look at lifetime Social Security pension benefits, again, this is under the the rules of 2010. And if we compare the present values for Q5, which is the high-income quintile, and Q1, which is low-income quintile, for the 1930 mortality regime, the high-income quintile has a present value of benefits that's $103,000 greater over their lifetime. For the 1960 mortality quintile, regime, that corresponding difference has risen to 173,000. So that difference has gotten $70,000 bigger. This isn't due to higher earnings or inflation or anything, because all of that is exactly the same between the two simulations. This is entirely due to the difference in mortality and to some degree in health. For women, the corresponding comparison is 48,000. So this mortality conditions, the change in mortality conditions would be making this spread greater. Okay, Medicare. This is health care for the elderly. This is also a very big program, and it's getting bigger faster than the Social Security pension program is getting bigger. So here there are two things going on. The first is that higher income people live longer, and so they receive Medicare benefits for longer. But on the other hand, higher income people are generally in better health, and so they don't need the system or use the system as much. And so these tend to offset. So you see under the 1930 mortality regime for males, the upper left-hand corner, there's not much difference. Actually, poor people get about $9,000 worth more over their lifetimes. But in 1960, that has changed, and now the rich get $44,000 more rather than $9,000 less. So there's been a swing of $53,000 in favor of the high-income group. And for women, that swing is even bigger by about $70,000. Okay, so that was Medicare. Medicaid, which is important for the long-term care, well, you can see that under both mortality regimes, this goes overwhelmingly to poor people because their health is much worse, and also because they qualify for it since it's a need-based program. And you also see that women have about twice the lifetime present value of benefits received compared to men. We know on the one hand they live longer, on the other hand they're in worse health and use the healthcare system more. Okay, let's move on. And then I'm skipping over some of the other programs in the interests of brevity here. If we look at now total benefits, the present value of total benefits for, I think, the 6 different programs, well, they're listed there. Social Security, disability, survivor's insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, and the pensions for poor, well, elder people. So the interquintile difference rises by $120,000 for men and a bit more than that for women, solely as a result of these changes in longevity and healthiness. Okay, so that's a sort of summary of what happens on the benefit side. Now, taxes, longevity hardly matters at all. And why? Well, because the variations in mortality are mostly having effects at more advanced, older ages when the elderly are paying, they have little or no labor income, they're not paying payroll taxes, and they're not paying that much in other kinds of taxes either, and whatever differences there are more heavily discounted and so on. So the tax side hardly matters. What we need to focus on is the benefit side here. And so when we look at total net benefits, that is present value of benefits received minus present value of taxes. It's basically the same story that we had when we just looked at total benefits. Well, now it's a $130,000 swing for men and $170,000 for women. So these are really quite huge effects due to these different mortality and health regimes by the widening of the socioeconomic status differences. Okay. Well, this is a table that summarizes it. We've already covered this. I don't think I need to go over that again. But let me look at them this way, which is so this is just looking at the present values as numbers, dollars, but here we're looking at a more proper measure of progressivity, which is relating those numbers to a measure of wealth. We call this inclusive wealth at age 50. And inclusive wealth here means a standard measure of wealth. It would include ownership of home and assets in the bank and investments and conventional things. And then we also include the present value of net benefits over the remaining lifetime, and we also add the present value of after-tax labor income for the remainder of life. So this is sort of what resources a person commands over the rest of their life after age 50. And so if we look at we use this inclusive wealth measure in the denominator, then we can say, well, how important is this change in the net present value of benefits over remaining lifetime, which was here just looked at numerically as I was showing you in the tables, charts before. And so you can see that there wasn't much difference for the lowest socioeconomic status group, the Q1, but for Q5, they had a 7% gain over that 30-year difference in birth cohort year because of the increasing life expectancy. And you see something very similar for women. There's a 9% swing. So this is quite substantial. Okay, so third part. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the 1960 birth cohort mortality regime results. And we'll consider 6 policies. Well, I may not show every one of them. So one of these is to raise the early retirement age, which is now 62 in the US, and to raise it to 64. Well, this is interesting because people at all socioeconomic status levels tend to claim Social Security pension benefits earlier than would be, let's say, actuarially optimal. So when you force people to wait longer before they can claim them, then the net present value of benefits, net present value of benefits goes up. So it goes up for the lowest income group, and it goes up for higher income group. And well, at the right-hand side, let's see, do I circle that? No. Okay, on the right-hand side, you can see the percentage change in the net present value of benefits, and you can see that it actually goes up more for richer people than for poorer people. So the effect of raising the early retirement age is actually somewhat regressive. It favors higher income people more than lower income people, but everyone's net present value goes up. It's sort of, yeah, okay. Now, of more interest, and I should say raising the early retirement age like that has very little fiscal effect on the 5 minutes, sure, the problems of the Social Security system. Now, raising the normal retirement age, has a more important effect in terms of helping to fix the problems. Here we talk about raising it from, well, it's currently going to go up to 67, and this policy would make it continue to go up to 70. So this would reduce the present value of benefits by 25% for the bottom quintile, and for a smaller 20% for the top quintile. Okay, and similarly for females. Cost of living adjustment. So there's been a proposal to change the cost of living adjustment in the US to a probably more technically appropriate measure, which rises at about 0.2% per year less rapidly for the elderly. And so what happens is this matters a lot for people who live a very long time. For people who live a shorter time, it doesn't matter as much. So this actually has a progressive effect. It hits the higher income people who live longer harder. Now, raising the usual eligibility age for Medicare from 65 to 67. This is sort of partially dismantling what little bit of a national health service we have in the US. So what would this do? Well, under the 1960 mortality regime, there's a reduction in the present value of Medicare benefits of about 5% for the poor people, lowest quintile, about 3.5% for the top quintile, and similarly for females. So this is making the system less progressive. Reducing the marginal replacement rate by 1/3 for high-income workers. Okay, we have bend points in our replacement rate, and I think the second bend point occurs at, I think it's at around the 70th percentile of lifetime earnings. And so above that, the replacement rate would be, it's currently, the marginal replacement rate is only 15%. It would knock it down to 10%. This makes very little difference. But a more significant change is if that bend point is moved to lower income, it's moved to the median income position, and then above that you get 0. So it reduces the marginal benefit rate to 0, the marginal replacement rate to 0 above that point. This has larger savings for the public pension system, not surprisingly, and of course it is quite highly progressive. For example, if we compare the effect between, well, on the right there, the baseline is the current policy, the bend points, the contrast is this new policy. That reduces the sort of absolute advantage of the top quintile from 173,000 to 131,000, or by 40,000 or so, and similarly for females. Well, if you look at total benefits, you get this picture. It doesn't really add much, I would say. You again see that the gap is reduced by about $40,000 when you do this business of having a 0 marginal replacement rate above median earnings history. So to summarize, I must have just about 0 time left. But this, again, well, this is using a different measure. This is comparing the size of these changes to lifetime consumption rather than the inclusive wealth measure. And we can see again that sort of recapitulate with a new measure what I've just said. I think I'll skip that. If you're interested, you'll be able to find this on the website. And so just some very broad conclusions. Top half of the income distribution has benefited much more from rising life expectancy than the bottom half. The widening mortality differentials reduce the progressivity of public transfers really very substantially. The widening mortality differentials also interact with potential policy changes actually in fairly complicated ways. I thought that would be more straightforward than it turned out to be. And all these matters really need to be considered as legislative bodies are considering how to restructure public programs in response to the fiscal needs that come from population aging. Thank you.
Have you looked at end-of-life costs of care? Do they have a significant impact on the projections?
Yes, they are taken into account in this. Well, they must have, their effect is implicit here, but they must matter a lot. We know they matter a lot in the United States and probably everywhere else. We know that they're very high in the last year of life, and the year before they're higher, and even if you go back 5 or 6 or 7 years before end of life, you see that the costs are beginning to rise for health care.
There's also a gradient.
You think there's a gradient in the timing of the, yeah. Okay, I have seen something about that. It should be implicit in these results. I believe it is the case that the lower socioeconomic status groups are more costly towards the end of life, and I think more inclined to do everything possible, even when it may not really be medically advisable. So that's sort of, I think I have read that. It's not something I have firsthand knowledge of, but yes, it's a very important part of this